Hi, welcome to this week's Raqs Talks. I'm Perizaad.
I'm Faizeh.
And this week, we are so excited. We have the wonderfully, fabulously talented Aubre Hill.
Yay! Thank you for having me. It's a joy.
Thank you so much for joining us. So why don't we just hop right into it? How did you get into Middle Eastern dance in the first place?
It's been an epic journey, and it began very randomly, to be totally honest. I was originally a dancer of a variety of other different forms, very much a studio kid growing up. So I learned jazz and ballet and tap and hip hop and did some competitive ballroom, musical theater, any dance form I could get a hold of in the little town that I grew up in, kind of thing. And then when I started college, I was actually already teaching a few of those forms. And so I sent my resume out to all the local studios around the college. And I was able to get a position teaching and developing the tap program at one of the local schools that was mainly a belly dance program. And because the studio owner, Jennifer McIntyre, she was an old school belly dancer from back in the 60s. She was a part of Busada, which was kind of the Pacific Northwest version of Ball and Knot. We did our first studio recital for the holidays. So I had my tap dancers come out, and I was doing some of the jazz program as well and everything. And then the belly dancers came out. I was blown away, mainly because I was very young at that point, and the idea of these women coming out in such confidence and ownership was something that I was really searching for and trying to find. And I really only at that point in my life could say I could find it for a few moments when I was dancing, when I was in that stage space, when I would lose the shoulds and the filters of who I was supposed to be and all of these lovely things. So I signed up for the next class and it took over my life. One class turned into four, turned into me taking every single class there was available at the studio. I didn't realize that my teacher at the time was kind of also curating me to start doing solo performances. It was the era of what was known as bellygrams. So I started doing things like that, as well as setting out my rug at the farmer's market and busking it in that type of way, and just really diving into really street performance kind of experience and what that meant to be an artist in a very accessible way. It just continued to evolve. It's been an amazing journey, and so much of it has kind of grown out of the creative necessity in the moment. I never could have planned this journey. Definitely could not have, because so many things were not even available or possible at various points of the time, and how this form and this community have grown and evolved so much over the decades has been incredible. So it is that constant space of just being so grateful for having truly just stumbled into it by accident.
Nice. I think that we met when you came up and did Hips of Fury. Did we meet before that? That is when I remember meeting you. So
we finally officially had conversation. Yes, for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that was a fusion-oriented event. And then a few years after that, though, Qabila Folk Dance Company started in 2010? 2011. So only a few years later, you had moved into more of a focus on folk dance.
It's interesting to talk to various people in the community, because I think from externally, it can look like I've been moving around in those different forms, but I've always been learning and obsessed with actually the vastness and the connection across a wide range of different styles.
I get that.
I've always been very interested in both the idea of the social forms, the folkloric forms, what happens within cultural expression and exchange in that type of way when people are getting a chance to really feel truly themselves and that they belong into a group setting in that type of aspect. So social dance, folk dance in that type of way has always been something I've been very interested in. And then the idea of the kind of curated form that you see within the stage space, whether that's within Raqs Sharqi or whether that's in a variety of other elements, if you think of even Reda technique, things along those lines, right? How you're then curating a sense of cultural expression for the stage space that is delineating itself as somehow being different than where the audience sits. And then for myself, being very much a cultural mix of a variety of different elements of things, the idea of fusion always felt very much a space where I can explore deeper senses of my own cultural identity through movement, and how through the crossroads of different seemingly contrasting or conflicting cultural elements, how they come together through movement in fusion. So these kind of three categories, if you wanted to put it that way, I think of them as more being a part of a whole tree, right? And that how they're connected in that type of way. But they've always been elements that I have been deeply intrigued in and trained in constantly. And so within the performance side of it, or what I get a chance to curate and kind of share with the community, that ends up being a pendulum swing a little bit, right? So you end up spending a lot of time producing something that might be more particularly focused on certain stylizations. And then I'd finish that project, and then I would feel the need very much so to pendulum swing to the other side and do something completely different, right? So externally, I think it has probably seemed that I have moved around in these different styles, but they're all a part of my like home space and practice and educational rigor always. I think my philosophy around learning movement is a little bit different in that type of way, so that I think of any movement that I'm learning about, whether it's boxing or martial arts or anything like that, is really getting a chance to tap into my relationship with my body and expand my awareness in a bigger sense, so that I'm not utilizing the movement to develop a habit or a singular language, but that any movement that I do expands the vastness of my understanding. And thus, any training I do isn't about specializing in that form, right? But is about fine-tuning my tool, which is me, right? And in that way, it makes it so that they're not contradictory each other, like, right, you know, that type of element. It doesn't, and it also allows for the fact that they don't then kind of bleed into each other. When I want to do, say, something that is very Egyptian, I have to think about what is the language, the movement language, the aesthetics that I'm pulling from to be able to express in that form. We do this all the time, right? Because we tend to curate how we express ourselves. If we use the example of language, very much with the people that we're around, right? If you are hanging out with your grandparents, you curate your words a little more specifically with your grandparents than, hey, if you're saying like hanging out with a bunch of your friends, right? There's a variety of words that I use in one context I don't use in the other, right? So the idea, exactly, yeah, right? And when you're thinking about these contexts, right, I think that's how I kind of look at the idea then of the stylization. I'm utilizing it within the context, how a movement is different when it's on a large stage versus when I'm in somebody's backyard at like a picnic or something, right? So that context really helps clarify how and why and the embodiment behind the movement in a way that becomes less confusing between all the different elements.
I think bodies just also like to be like used in different ways. I think, you know, once you've trained yourself in one way, you know, and you're moving towards another, like it's really exciting when you're learning that way, but I think your body does miss it. Cause I know, you know, when I used to do both more of a Raqs Sharky style and more of the fat chant style, when I was doing mostly fat chants and not enough sparkle, I wasn't happy. And I was like, no, I don't want to do this anymore. I need more sparkle in my life. I need more fringe. I need rhinestones. No. But now that I'm like focusing way more on what I call the sparkle, now that I'm focusing way more on Raqs Sharky, you know, and it's very different because like, you know, with Raqs Sharky, there's more, you know, like we got to be gigging. We got to be present on our social media. And, you know, are you in competitions? Are you winning? Are you placing? Are you teaching workshops? Are you this? And I'm like, I miss dancing with my friends. But I think you're absolutely right. Where it's interesting because you don't want to get muddy, as you said. Like that's the one thing is I don't really like people can be very, very good dancers, but if the dance that they are presenting at the time is too muddy, I get turned off very, very quickly. Whereas when I see dancers, like a piece that we shared of Stephanie's for her interview was one of her competition pieces at Hot Rocks, and you could very clearly see the contemporary dance and the belly dance. And to me, that was fascinating to see what aspects she used, how she blended them, that sort of a thing. I appreciate when my Egyptian looks Egyptian and my fusion looks fusion, and I can tell what I'm looking at, definitely.
Yeah, and I think it makes it clear as to what kind of decisions you're making about your expression. In the grand scope of where art can go, there needs to be a space of experimentation that has successes and has a lot of failures, right? And that creative space is, I think, vital for the innovation as to how we grow, especially as we're really moving into a much more global society. And we're thinking about how does that mean that we compartmentalize things more, but we're influencing each other more? Like, how does that all work? And I do wonder if we generally as Americans, because we sit in a wide range of different cultural identities, right? The three of us share certain of those, and we also have distinctions from each other, right? So I think there's like, when I think about what feeds me in certain elements, right? It's some aspect of that for me. So I think the need sometimes to do these various things, I do wonder, just a hypothesis, if that's also about the fact that we are a crossroad of so many different influences.
I can see that for sure. And I also it's like you say, when you bring your own experiences to it, it also is going to develop your voice as an individual artist. Because, for me, I was raised very much in the American cabaret style, which has huge Turkish influences. But it's also definitely cultivated for a mix of Maynard audience and American audience. And then also, just like you, I was in musical theater. So I'm always going to throw in my little ooh, no, sort of looks. And it's just, but that's people expect that when I dance. They expect cheeky little faces and stuff like that. That might not necessarily translate into, if I were performing for, it's not that they wouldn't get it, but they'd also, if I were performing for an exclusively Maynard audience in an exclusively Maynard setting, it's not that they wouldn't get it, but they'd also be that's an interesting choice. All right, cool.
It's language that doesn't reside in that kind of equation, right? So it just kind of, it doesn't necessarily offend. It just is I don't understand.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's when you post a Fat Chance style video, and then there's what is this? Because they don't understand. I usually just say it's an Americanized version of Middle Eastern dance. And okay. But someone who is from the culture, if they've never seen that kind of, it's what is this? Because it doesn't necessarily bear any resemblance to what's going on at home.
Well, I think we're coming across so many complicated conversations specifically about that, because now the pandemic in particular shifted everything so much more online than it even was before, right? And as soon as it's online, you're now in a global space. And so much of our niche subcultural elements are expressions in that subculture. And now it's being placed within a vastness, and all of a sudden the context around that expression is lost. And so there have been reinterpretations as to what the expression was about. And I think the online aspect is really demanding us to be more specific as to who we're talking to and what we're creating. Right? Because if I'm just going to throw something out on YouTube or TikTok or anything like that, I got to know that I have a global audience potentially that's seeing that. So if I curate my language specifically to my Southern California community, right? I'm missing out on the opportunity of who is actually in my audience. It's when you were talking about when you have a Maynard audience, right? How you curate certain elements more specifically, potentially to express them, to connect to that audience. Yep. So when we're in a global space, right? We're stumbling our way through how we learn how to do this right now. And there's a lot of kind of harsh lessons that I think are happening, much needed, I think, to understand more specifically into what we're expressing and why we're expressing it and who we're expressing it to. I think some of the tactics of how these conversations are happening are unfortunate, but I think that the fact the conversations are happening is really well needed.
I think that's exactly it. I think, it's unfortunately how some of them are happening, but it's important that they're happening. I think you've just nailed it completely.
Yeah.
But that's something that we experience in Southern California, and especially in the American cabaret vocabulary, I feel a lot, because Adrienne ended up focusing so much on Egyptian dance because she got a gig at a hookah lounge that was owned by Egyptians, and they were like, well, where's your stick? And so then she had to learn how to dance with an asaya. And that's one of the things that, like, because that's who she was performing for. And she's like, well, instead of being like, you don't appreciate my art, just being like, okay, let me like focus on this since y'all are paying me. And it's, you know, and Laura talks about like, well, something we talk about all the time, you know, you don't play certain genres of music for certain types of audiences because of cultural issues between those two groups. And it's like, or, you know, it can come down to like with Laura, where she's like, well, you know, there's this one time that I was dancing at Babouche, and yeah, the majority of my set was, you know, this style, but I noticed that I had an Indian family sitting there. So I chose a song on like the end of the playlist that was Indian, and I had a few sort of classical Indian moves that I knew from my time at UCSB, and they got up, they loved me, they threw all their money at me, and it was fabulous.
Yeah, because you're saying that you see them. Right?
Yes,
when
exactly.
You, as a dancer, right, you're like, your job is to curate the experience for the audience, right? And I mean, well, I'll pause on that idea, right? Like, so, I mean, and you see this too when you go to like the big clubs or cabarets even within Cairo, right? Like how certain trends have happened depending on who was in the audience, right? Why did so much Khaliji music start coming into Raqs Sharqi? Because there was a bunch of Saudis that were coming into the clubs and watching the shows. And if they're going to sit there, you're going to make sure that you say, hello, you are welcome here. I see you. I appreciate that you're here. We're in this experience together, right? So I'll totally admit that as I was like learning and diving and getting into this, right? Like we have those moments of like learning enough information that becomes dangerous, and then like you can hopefully keep digging. And I got to that space where I really started judging a variety of my decisions from the past, in particular with an American cabaret. And I keep digging because like you hopefully keep doing that. There's so much to learn. And then I got to a space where I like came out, not the other end, but I came into a space of more compassion to understand. It was just like, oh, wait a second. We were sitting with an audience that was extremely diverse. So we would have the song that might have one Greek song, or we might have like one Armenian song, or like it depended on who your audience was. And we actually needed to be extremely versatile in that type of way to include our very diverse audience, including all of the audience members that didn't know any of this, right? That were just like your standard American audience member that was just like, cool, that's pretty, right? Like you needed to include all of them. So we had this different type of demand in that type of way to be so versatile, versus like if you go and see like Dina's show, one, everyone knows exactly who she is, right? Like, you know, like they're coming to see her, right? She's not having to prove who she is culturally speaking or anything like that. Right. And within that, like then she can relate and connect to the audience in more of a kind of person space of things, which is why she's such an amazing icon of strong feminism. Right? Because that can then be the kind of platform that she's connecting to, versus like, look how much I know about Egyptian culture. Right? She doesn't have to prove that. Right. So like her curation ends up being a different space than like what we need to do. Like, and because most of us sit outside the culture, right? I'm always interested in looking at how much of our performance is also about us proving that we know what we're doing. Right?
Totally.
And then how much do we get a chance to then be like, and this is my unique gift that I want to offer, right? Like how much do we get to like add into that? Because there's a sense of that we need to be respectful. We also need to say like, yes, to that family, like that you see them and appreciate and understand the culture, right? And then when you make a mistake, it's just like, oh, fumbled. Okay, I like showed off a whole other kind of side that they might have necessarily seen as like, being not directly disrespectful, but meaning like, oh, you don't actually understand us, right? So like how much of our unique voice can we put in there in a way that is still within the aesthetics of the language, right? But it does make for a more complex space, right? When you're working with navigating a diverse audience, which preps us perfectly for online work too, maybe.
I would love if you are willing to share. I would love to hear some of the challenges and triumphs as you're going through like how it is affecting your art, just going through your health
journey
trials right now.
What do we call this? So background around that, the beginning of this year, I found a lump in my armpit. Just a little promotion, public announcement, like do those checkups, even if you're not of the age bracket they start suggesting it to, because I'm younger than the bracket that this comes into when they're like, do those self-exams. And so it turns out that, I've been diagnosed with breast cancer. And so I'm now in the midst of chemo, hence the no hair look, going for the Sinead O'Connor look. So it has been I'm going to use this word again, humbling experience, because I've been someone that's trained my body all of my life. I also have a tremendous amount of willpower and stamina because of all of that training and personality. And this shifts all of that. Like if you think about like your energetic well, it's nowhere near what it used to be. And that doesn't matter how much I want to push forward and do something. So it has been a conversation constantly about relearning where my priorities need to be within things, and thinking about, okay, if I have this much energy, what do I want to create within it? What is the most important things that I create in this day? And first and foremost, it needs to be my health, because I want to make sure that I move forward through all of this storm strong, and that I can continue doing the things that I want to do and nurture in this life. And then making sure that I can serve my students and that I can do a full job in that, and that nothing is compromised in that, which means that I put rest in between my classes now in a way that I never would have before, and give myself the ability to make my schedule a little bit more malleable, so that if that week is not a good health week, that I take a break and I just go and sleep it off as much as I possibly can. And so thinking about the quality of things and really going quality over quantity, and knowing that I got to be very specific with my priorities in that type of way. And that has to be flexible, because that reserve, that energy reserve, changes on a daily basis. And that part was immediately very frustrating. And now it feels more like just that same kind of improvisation that is life. Like, right, this is what globally all of us have been doing through the pandemic, right? And I'm just continuing that surfing exploration a little longer, right? And being able to go, okay, new day, new circumstances. Now these are what we have to work with. So now I evaluate the plan of things. So there's the energetic side of that, and looking at that. And also my training and everything that I do is constantly in conversation with my body. So that part hasn't necessarily changed, but letting go of the expectations that I'll be able to do something a particular way, or like I've always done it this big or for this long, and being able to go, and not today. Cool. Okay, let's do what is going to help facilitate something that feels good and is healthy in my body. Because if it feels good in the dancing, right, then it also exudes a sense of that loveliness, that yumminess, that joy, that happiness that I want in the movement. It's not helpful for me to like do it and be like, oh, I feel really exhausted right now. Like, what am I trying to express in my dancing, even if it's just in my training of my space? So the flexibility in that side of things. And then there's obviously some elements of thinking about self-identity in different types of ways. They are very forthright when you're starting chemo about like the various side effects that will happen. And the one that they want to talk about the most is your hair, because it is such a externally visual aspect of your identity in different types of ways. And part of me was like, it's just hair, like it should grow back as soon as I finish this treatment and everything along those lines. And really in the grand scheme of the priorities of everything, it's not a big deal, right? It is still humbling to see my head.
You have a nicely shaped head, fortunately.
You do.
It's definitely like, like I catch myself off guard a little bit, like, whoa, okay. And I still like this sounds funny, but the sensations around your head, it like just feels like my hair is pulled back, like, cause it kind of, your scalp kind of springs up. It doesn't have any weight on it. So it feels like it's pulled back. And so I commonly still feel like I need to put my hair down. So it's a strange thing. It's also a very external expression. So when you're out and about or anything along those lines, knowing that it influences how people perceive me, that's interesting by itself and everything too. It is something that I had dabbled in prior to this, in the idea of moving into my 40s and thinking about not wanting to necessarily be a part of the entertainment world anymore. It was an amazing adventure and I'm really grateful for that time. But thinking about more how I want to facilitate elements along artistic expression, education, community, things along these aspects of things that have less to do with the gig and more about conversational elements of things, both on stage as well as off stage, that I started playing around with the idea of what kind of decisions would I make if I had not been thinking about allowing myself to be like gig ready at all times, right? Mm-hmm. Like the idea that there were certain kinds of influences into how I was presenting myself over the 20 years prior to that were very much dictated by my career path. And it was an interesting space moving into my 40s and being able to go, what would I like to do within that? How would I like to have my hair? This was not my choice. but so I started doing some things. I started cutting my hair short. I, shaved the back of it for a little while. I started playing around. I was like, because part of it too was the idea of some of these physical elements are so wrapped up in gender expression. And thinking about what does that mean to me? What does it mean to be feminine and have not long, luscious hair that's all curly, right? And not like all these things, or like growing my hair out, which I had a variety of gray and like things along those lines. So it was an interesting experiment already within the identity of that. This has pushed it over the cliff a bit more. Yeah. There's definitely some aspects of that, and thinking about my comfortable zone within that. I've been sharing some little improv videos on TikTok as well as on Instagram, and having those moments of being like, oh, that's my head, okay. But the expression is there and there's something of my heart in it, so I'm going to share it and just fully be in the who that I am right now, and move one day at a time forward through it. So it's been interesting. There's still about 5 more months of this to move through. It's going to get harder before it gets easier. And so there's that space of like, deep breath. Okay, here we go. Dance, even if it's less rigorous, is always my grounding space. It's always my space of solace. It's my space to process all of my emotions. So even if it means laying on the floor and like wiggling around to the music, I will always dance in some type of way. I will find a way, because I feel like embodying and expressing that through all of my cells allows me to, be a much more sane person, as well as be able to kind of dive deeper into what those emotions are.
Yeah. Absolutely.
All right, what's coming up?
So I'm really excited because with the pandemic, right, everything either shut down, right, or moved online in some kind of form, and we all got really creative and had some fun learning lessons about technology and all kinds of fun things, right, as we were moving online. So I did a handful of my productions online, and then kind of paused on that too, because there was a variety of different things going on, and now we weren't necessarily thinking about how we coordinate shows in our local space, right? But now we're like, how do we coordinate shows across the entire globe? Like, I want to see that show that's happening in France right now, or this one in Cairo, or that one in New York City, right? So paused on a variety of my productions, including my monthly Hafla. And so I'm really excited to be teaming up with Dance Garden to be doing our Haflas again. So the LA Haflas are back, which I'm super excited about. And in continuing to foster and nurture our community, in doing this in a safe way that will also really encourage the creativity and the experience. The performers will be in the studio, so we'll be filming this at Dance Garden, and they'll be streamed live, so the audience can be anywhere. And in that type of way, when the performers can be socially distanced and spaced out, and we can make sure everyone is being safe along those lines in a way that feels comfortable for everybody. And that way the audience can be safely in their own home or projecting us on their screens or whatever the case is, however people want to watch their shows. And so we have 4 that we've set up for this year. And in the way that I like to do things, they're all themed. So one gives a creative kind of seed for the dancers to be able to work with. And then also a beautiful connective thread for the audience, whether they are familiar with the dance or totally new to it, right? So they get a chance to experience this. So June 11th is going to be our first one. And coming out of all of this, the theme is homage. So we can think about the celebration, respect, and honor that we would like to pay towards people, things, places, ideas. And that show is coming together really well. So I'm very excited about that. The one after that will be August 13th. We'll be doing dancing through our history. So looking at history through a wide range of different styles and time periods along that aspect. October, one of my absolute favorites. It's one of the few that I do every single year theme-wise. It will be The Haunting. So we get a chance to get really interestingly extra creative in that type of way. And then finishing things out in December with Winter Wonderland.
Nice. That's awesome. And I'm sure that gives you something to look forward to as well. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was one of those things that when Lauren and I were first talking about it, I got really excited in that type of way of like, yes, I want to do all the things. And then I had to stop and pause and then like, is this something energetically you can do? Can you follow through in a way that will feel good? That if health shifts around, right? Like, can I fully do this? And deep in my gut, I said yes, that I want this, I need this to happen. And not just for myself, but I also feel that with the pandemic, the community has really fragmented out from each other. And I'm seeing so many dancers feel very, very lost right now because they're not getting a chance to connect with each other. And we're going through, like I said, these huge complicated conversations and this growth. And I'm seeing specifically within kind of our like advanced beginner, intermediate dancers in particular that don't necessarily feel they have a space to stand in a global space of conversation or performances, right? Feel extra lost in this amazing art form that has empowered them in some type of way, and they don't feel they don't understand where they can participate anymore or how they can connect or where they can even explore what their art means, right? Like so much of this is just about doing it and experiencing it and learning in that type of way. So I was like, I want to bring the Haflas back so that we can have that connection with our community.
Nice.
Well, and we're really excited to see what happens with Qabila. And is it Beyajja? That's one of your, you have like so many troops. You have 1,000 troops.
So there's 3 technically, but yeah, some of them are on a bit of a hiatus depending on what's happening in people's lives. So yeah, the Qabila Foundation, which encompasses the 3 different chapters of the Qabila Folk Dance Company, which is amazing to me. That was not a part of the plan. It just beautifully happened. So now we have a folk dance company in Los Angeles, which is the original one, in the Bay Area, and now in Seattle as well. And so we're continuing to grow and evolve. We're developing new educational programming for all ages, as well as some different resources for educators in schools, as well as dance studios and things along those lines. So things are really growing and evolving in that type of way, which is exciting. And then I have the Beyajja Dance Theatre, which is been such a beautiful project with a variety of my dancers that have studied with me for many years. A great way to think about the large ensemble, because there's certain things that you can do with a large ensemble that's totally different than a soloist or a duet. And so that group has been on a little bit of a hiatus. We did start the pandemic rehearsing all the time and everything along those lines, and then sometimes it just devolved to drinking some wine and holding space for each other and like thinking about how our identities within dance is changing, how our lives were changing. 2 of our members right now are getting ready to have their very first babies, which is really exciting. And so that group still is very much a social space for each other, but is on hiatus from actual practices on a regular basis. And then Lumina is actually my longest running dance company. And that one has shifted into more project-based things. We used to rehearse twice a week and do weekly gigs and all these different things and everything like that. And within people's lives, people moving to different states, focusing more on like what are the pieces that we want to do, what do we want to share, things along those lines. It's turned into more project specific things. So like the piece that you mentioned earlier that Steph and I did, that's a Lumina piece, bottom of the river, and it was a witch coven piece originally, and really became more of a statement as to kind of the history of witch persecution as a way of controlling women within society. So so we create interesting different pieces, and so within that it's more project-based, where it's just like, hey, I have an idea for this piece, or hey, there's this opportunity, who's available, who wants to do this. So they have evolved, as I think is necessary with life. But I have an incredible dance family across all three of those groups, and they all support each other across the different groups and everything too, which is I just absolutely love.
Nice. Where can we find you online?
Basically, I have my website, aubrehill.com, and then I'm also on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. Are those all? I'm on Twitter as well, but it's not my favorite, to be totally completely honest. But I do love getting a chance to hear from everybody on social media. I know I'm one of those few people that love social media, actually, because I love people, like getting a chance to like connect and see what people are doing and share. So any of those places, reach out anytime.
Awesome.
Well, Aubrey, thank you so much. We appreciate so much you coming on the show and talking to us about everything. Really, it's just, you're such a light within this community. So I know that this is going to be a really important interview for a lot of people. They're going to be really excited to see you. Well, that was Aubre Hill. Aubrey, thank you so much, as we said, for coming on. We look forward to all of the projects for Beyajja, Lumina, and Qabila, now that you have so kindly informed me of their names. But in the meantime, this has been our Raqs Talks for this week. I'm Perizaad.
I'm Faizeh.
And please give us a like, subscribe, and comment if you haven't already. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. Masalama.